So I joined Fair Election Center about 4.5 years ago. And before that, I spent 20 years all across the country. I worked on a lot of campaigns. I had the opportunity to work on the presidential all the way down to city council races and school board races. I worked individually for candidates. I've worked for different organizations on behalf of candidates doing independent expenditures. And I also worked for some super PACs. I had the opportunity to work in Capitol Hill with Congressman John Dingell, specifically on the Affordable Care Act, which was amazing. I learned so much from him. I worked for many organizations like Everytown for Gun Safety, MoveOn.org, the National Association for Arab American Communities. I spent so much time traveling the country, talking to so many great people. And one of the really interesting things of doing that work, whether it was partisan work or nonpartisan work, access to the ballot kept coming up. For 20 years before joining Fair Election Center, I worked on campaigns. I first got the bug when I was 7 years old. I remember in 1988 watching the political conventions. And I remember my mom walking into the living room looking at me and telling me to go outside and play. And I looked at her, I was like, no, I'm watching the conventions. And she didn't believe me. And so she challenged me. She said, okay, Rebecca. Basically, she was like, okay, little girl, if you're really watching the political conventions, tell me what's happening. And I was able to tell her from gavel to gavel about all the different speakers, all the different political commercials that I was watching that week. And I remember my mom looking at me and saying, you're a strange little girl. But I got the bug. As I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, I remember my mom registering people to vote, whether or not it was at the local public library, whether or not it was at a school, or if it was at the local grocery store. She would spend countless hours making sure that people understood that voting mattered and that they needed to register to vote. So watching both of my parents' community involvement really got me to thinking about civic engagement even before I knew what the word was. I had no concept of civic engagement as a word, but I knew it because I saw it reflected in my family experience. So when I got to college, I got an internship and I worked with the local police department, and then I worked with the local mayor's office. And I began to start to piece together what civic engagement was. When I was 20 years old, I got recruited to run for a local office. So imagine it, I'm in my dorm room, that is my campaign headquarters. I'm trying to raise money, but I'm also too scared to raise money. But I knew a couple things to do. I knew how to go knock on doors and deliver my message, and I came up with my own messaging. And I showed up to parades and community events and shook lots of hands, took lots of pictures, and talked to so many different people. And that really got me to thinking about engagement. Well, I won in the nonpartisan race in the primary, but I lost to a former state senator in the general election. So from there, that experience taught me that there's a business side of politics. There's a whole thing with how campaigns work. And so that prompted me to learn more about campaigns, eventually becoming a campaign manager, but also spending so much time across the country, really learning about different communities. Eventually, I got to Capitol Hill. I worked for Congressman John Dingell, and I got to work on the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, which is a very unique hallmark legislation that took over 150 years for it to happen. So once again, I got to learn the legislative side of politics. After that, I became an advocate. I did some advocacy work on Capitol Hill, and then I got recruited to go run a congressional campaign in my hometown. I did that, and then I worked on a governor's race and did many other legislative races across the country. Eventually, I made my way back to DC, doing some more advocacy work, working for groups like the National Association for Arab American Communities, working with groups like MoveOn.org and Everytown for Gun Safety, really honing some of my political skills that I developed over the years. But one of the things that I noticed in all of my campaign and advocacy experiences is that there were still lots of people in our country who didn't have access to voting. And it didn't matter how many millions of dollars and even billions of dollars that were spent on political campaigns, if those who are eligible to vote and who are trying to vote aren't able to vote, then what are we really doing as a democracy? So the opportunity came up for Fair Election Center. And what really drove me to Fair Election Center is its dedication to removing barriers to voting. Regardless of your political beliefs, regardless of the zip code that you live in, if you are an eligible person who can vote in this country, you should have access to voting in this country, regardless of what your political belief is. So I'm very proud of the work of Fair Election Center, of making sure that we're kicking down doors and we're removing barriers, whether or not it is a student on a college campus, if it's a returning citizen who did their time, they served their time, and now they're trying to get reintegrated back into community. If they're eligible to vote, they should be able to vote. Whether or not it's someone who has duly registered in their state, and unfortunately, because that particular state decided to kick them off the ballot through a voter purge, we fight back because we firmly believe in this country, as long as we have the First Amendment, people should be able to exercise it through the use of voting as their tool of choice. I joined Fair Election Center during COVID, during the pandemic. And there were so many things that were happening with voting rights when I came on board January 2021. We just had our first national election where there were many states who had to scramble and had to figure out how do you administer elections during a national emergency such as the COVID pandemic. How do you make sure that there's enough poll workers? Because we saw during spring 2020 that there were many polling locations across the country that weren't able to open up because you didn't have enough people, because there were a lot of people who were poll workers for decades who were scared to serve in that capacity because of the unknowns, because of the COVID pandemic. And so coming to Fair Election Center in 2021, one of the biggest challenges that we had to face was stability, because we are dedicated and committed to the right to vote. We also knew that there were, unfortunately, many legislators across the country who felt like they deserved to choose their voters instead of voters having the ability to pick who their politicians are. And there were so many bills that were introduced across the country in over 40 states that made it tougher to vote, made it tougher for community organizations to register people to vote. So we started to experience a lot of challenges, a lot of backlash to the uptick of a multicultural democracy that showed up in 2020. So as an organization, we had to figure out, what does it look like in this new world where the Voting Rights Act is under attack, where sections 3 and 5 is being stripped away, under which section 2 is barely there, quite frankly. When we see other pieces of legislation, whether on the federal level or on the state level, that criminalizes different aspects of voting. So for instance, in Georgia, if you're standing in line for hours and your neighbor gives you a bottle of water because you've been in line for hours, Georgia has criminalized it. Or a state like Florida that says if you live in an area and you're helping 2 or more of your neighbors turn in their ballot because for whatever reason, maybe a medical reason, they can't turn in their ballot on their own, that's now a criminalized act. Or a state like Arizona that says, hey, show your papers. If we don't really think that you are a US citizen, we're gonna challenge you regardless of your American citizenship. We're gonna challenge your right to vote. So as we started to see those attacks against voters, as an organization, we had to figure out if we are truly looking at ways to remove barriers and eligible folks in this country from being able to vote, then we had to fight back. And so as our program side has tremendously grown over the last several years, as an organization, we also knew that we needed to hire more operations staff to make sure that we have the infrastructure as Fair Election Center continues to grow in the future. So over the last few years, while I've been at Fair Election Center, we have grown by over 300%. When we look at budget, we have grown tremendously and more than doubled when we look in terms of staff. So Fair Election Center is definitely on the upswing, even in a challenging environment. The future of this organization is bright, even in challenging times where voting rights are under attack. We have dedicated staff who are extremely dedicated to the right to vote in this country. We have the opportunity to work with our Voting Rights Project, with our team of litigators and our policy advocates who are working both offensively and defensively around the country to make sure that good voting laws that support the right to vote in this country are enacted across state legislatures, but also making sure that legislation that would be bad for voting in this country doesn't pass. So whether or not it's the courtroom or it's through a state house, we are actively working to make sure we're working in communities with different other organizations to improve the state of voting rights in this country. Through our Work Elections Project, we have helped recruit hundreds of thousands of people to become poll workers. There are 47 states that does in-person voting, and those states require people to help with that. So we do our part with working with over 5,000 jurisdictions in this country to make sure that they have the people, the resources that they need, the workforce that they need in order for elections to be carried out in person. And finally, through our Campus Vote Project, we work hand in hand with administrators across the country on their campuses, with students who we hire as democracy fellows, that make sure that students are aware of how to register to vote on their campus. And they're also aware when there's an opportunity to vote on campus. After all, these students are a part of their community and they have a voice too. So we should be looking for more ways to make sure that young people and quite frankly, all people on college campuses understand their right to vote. Bob Brandon is an amazing person to work alongside of, and Bob Brandon is an amazing person to learn from. He is, quite frankly, a trailblazer in the public interest. There's a lot of things that he has done that has greatly impacted this country through the course of his career. I am very fortunate to have been by his side the last few years and running together Fair Election Center. Fair Election Center, quite frankly, is the foundation. It's the house that Bob built. So I look forward of taking the best things that we've done over the years at Fair Election Center and continue to move those things forward. I'm also excited, and Bob and I share this thought, and we talk about this a lot, about the future of Fair Election Center and different things that we could do to continue to improve the various programming that we do. There are some people who are moving out of civic engagement, and there are some people who say that the fight for voting rights is just too tough now. But at Fair Election Center and under Bob's leadership, and even the future under my leadership, we understand that the fight for voting rights is a noble one. It's a fight that every single generation, we're going to have to keep that fight going to make sure the wins of the previous generation continues to move forward, regardless of political administrations. For those of you all who support voting rights and support civic engagement, now is the time to act and to invest, and quite frankly, to give. We don't have time to keep waiting for the future and figuring things out and waiting for the dust to settle. The fight for democracy is so important. It requires active investment now in order to move our country forward and to make sure that we have the democracy-filled future that we all anticipate and that we all hope for in order to pass down to future Americans. The fight for democracy is ongoing and it's never ending. There are times when it looks tough, and there are times when the opposition seems so overwhelming. But the good thing is that history oftentimes repeats itself. Democracy in America has been under attack since the founding of this country, but democracy in America still persists. So what I would tell people now is time to dig in, keep that fight going, because the next generation is literally waiting for you to hand off the baton. But if you give up the race now, you won't get to that next step to hand off the baton for that future generation that's ready, willing, and able to take that baton and move it forward. So now is the time to dig deeper in terms of supporting our democracy. It's the time to be creative. It's the time to do reflection and understand the fight for democracy is a noble fight.